The most quoted line in the movie was almost cut for being too small to matter. The studio that developed it lost faith and let it go. The actress everyone now pictures in the lead spent weeks training hard for a role she would never play. A feel-good summer comedy about a women's baseball league that history had nearly erased turned out to carry one of the messiest, most accident-prone productions of its era, full of real bruises, walkouts, and scenes too dark to keep. The film almost never happened at all. It took root in something nobody involved had ever heard of, until one quiet night in front of a television set. Number 1. A TV broadcast planted the seed. A filmmaker fresh off a comedy success settled in one evening for some ordinary television and stumbled onto a piece of her own country's past that had never once crossed her path. The show in question was a 1987 public broadcast documentary about the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, the wartime circuit that put women on the diamond in front of paying crowds throughout the Midwest. Penny Marshall took it in with mounting astonishment. She'd grown up steeped in the sport, yet here was a full-blown professional league, complete with teams, standout players, and championship runs that had simply vanished from public memory. What she couldn't have known was that this story was already making its way to her from another direction. Two producers had independently tracked down the rights to the league's history after unearthing the same forgotten chapter, and Marshall was already their top pick to direct, long before she knew such a job existed. She was drawn in by the very thing that had let the league fade into obscurity in the first place. A tale so far outside baseball's official narrative that even a die-hard fan could go a lifetime without hearing a word of it. A piece of overlooked American history had come within inches of staying lost forever. Turning that story into a movie, though, meant first navigating the graveyard where so many promising projects quietly expire. Number 2. Shelved by one studio, seized by another. For a while, the film existed in the limbo that swallows most of what Hollywood develops and never makes. It had first been set up at 20th Century Fox, the studio that sank money into getting it off the ground. Then the executives there got cold feet and pushed the project into turnaround, the holding state where a studio keeps a film on its books while it works up the nerve to either shoot it or let it die. Marshall, with the picture stalled, stepped away to direct Awakenings instead, and the baseball story sat on a shelf gathering dust. Then a rival pounced. Columbia, under the Sony umbrella, grabbed the property while it was loose and folded it straight into its own production slate. By the time Marshall came back from her other film, ready to return to the Women's League, the project she had originally signed onto belonged to a different studio than the one she had left it with. The handoff barely registered as news at the time, a routine bit of business between competitors. There is a quiet irony in how it all played out. The studio that decided it could live without the picture had to watch a direct competitor take that same cast-off and turn it into one of the biggest hits of the year. A film one company shrugged off as too risky went on to cross 9 figures at the box office for the company willing to take the chance. It became one of those stories the industry keeps telling itself, a lesson in how easily a future classic can slip through a studio's finger. Number 3. The lead part kept changing hands. Nearly half a dozen recognizable actresses cycled through consideration for Dottie Hinson before a single scene was shot. The casting process for this role turned into its own miniature drama, running alongside the story being written for the screen. Demi Moore was in the running early on before pregnancy took her out of contention. Deborah Winger came next, and she didn't take the role lightly. She put in real work training alongside the Chicago Cubs organization to master the sport's mechanics under professional guidance. Then, mere weeks before cameras were set to roll, she pulled out entirely. Her stated objection was the casting of Madonna, a musician with limited acting experience, in a major supporting role, which Winger felt undercut the seriousness of the project. She exited with a rare pay-or-play settlement worth millions, compensation owed regardless of whether she ever appeared on camera. Gina Davis then took on a part that seemingly every rising actress in town had wanted. The role, now inseparable from Davis's name, had passed through the hands of several bigger stars before it ever reached her, arriving only after that long chain of departures had run its course. She'd spend the production learning a physically demanding sport well enough to make it look natural on camera, walking into the same tension her predecessor had walked away from. Number 4. Hanks was told to bulk up, not slim down. Most actors preparing for a major role spend the lead-up months in the gym, trimming down and sharpening up for the camera. Tom Hanks got the reverse assignment. Penny Marshall wanted Jimmy Dugan, the burned-out, over-the-hill manager of the Rockford Peaches, to look instantly like a man who'd completely given up on himself. so she instructed Hanks to gain as much weight as he could manage and to make sure nobody, on screen or in the audience, would find him remotely appealing. Hanks went along without hesitation, transforming one of the most charming leading men of his era into a puffy, unshaven wreck. He had several other projects in production around this same period, which made his willingness to bury his usual charisma under Dugan's sagging frame even more notable. The studio could have easily leaned on his natural appeal. This film needed that appeal switched off entirely. Number 5. Real-life sisters were the blueprint for Dottie and Kit. The rivalry at the emotional heart of the film came straight out of a real family. Kelly Candele and Kim Wilson wrote the story, drawing directly on their own mother and aunt, two women who had played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League during its run. The competition between a steady, gifted older player and a hungrier, more volatile younger one came directly from life, drawn from people the storytellers had grown up around and watched all their lives, then reshaped with a screenwriter's care into something an audience could hold on to. The filmmakers were careful about how they handled that history. Dottie and Kit were inspired by the two real women, rather than modeled on them point for point, a distinction that mattered. It let the script chase a deeper emotional truth, without ever pretending to be a straight biography of anyone in particular. Those lives gave the two characters their backbone and their texture, while the drama stayed free to bend and shape itself into whatever the movie needed. There is a poignant footnote to all of it. Candele's mother lived just long enough to see the finished film, and how faithfully it captured the world she had once lived in, before she died only months after its release. She got to watch a major Hollywood production treat the league she had given part of her youth to as something worth remembering, which is more than most of those players ever expected to receive. Number 6. A throwaway line turned unforgettable. It read as pure filler on the page. A small bit of dialogue the writers dashed off without expecting anyone to remember it past the table read. The scene called for Jimmy Dugan to snap at a young player who breaks into tears mid-lecture in the dugout, and the line as written was just ordinary connective tissue, meant to land a quick laugh and move on. What turned that afterthought into something lasting was pure accident. Bitty Schramm, playing the reprimanded outfielder, genuinely broke down on camera without any direction to do so, and those real tears gave Hanks the perfect setup to explode. He rose to his full height and delivered his outraged reply that there's no crying allowed in the sport, with such total commitment that Marshall decided to leave the entire take untouched rather than trim a second of it. The line's legacy went far beyond anyone's expectations. The American Film Institute later placed it among cinema's most memorable quotes, and the Writers Guild eventually asked for the handwritten script page where it first appeared. A bit nobody on set believed in became the one thing most viewers can still recite word for word. Number 7. Punishing months of ballplayer training, 8-hour days, 6 days a week, for nearly the length of an entire baseball season before filming even began. That was the grueling regimen the cast committed to, working under real coaches and a technical advisor brought on specifically to turn professional actresses into believable athletes. The goal was authenticity on screen. Marshall wanted her cast to throw, catch, slide, and hit, convincingly enough that the finished movie would rarely need to cut to a stand-in, so the women repeated the fundamentals endlessly until the movements stopped looking rehearsed and started looking instinctive. For a comedy, the physical demands were unusually intense. Few films in any genre ask their cast to learn a competitive sport from scratch and then perform it live for cameras. Normally, stunt performers absorb that burden. Here, the actresses carried it themselves, day after day. By the time principal photography started, every bit of athleticism on screen belonged to the actresses themselves. What looks effortless and natural in the finished film was earned through months of aches, bruises, and repetition, all logged long before the cameras ever rolled on the first real day of shooting. The coaches who ran that camp would later marvel at how far the group had come from their first awkward attempts. Number 8. Madonna's presence kept the set unsettled. Before sunrise, while most of the crew was still asleep, one castmate was already out running long distances, alone in the dark. Madonna kept to her own schedule and her own habits throughout production, and by many accounts from those around her, that didn't always mesh well with everyone else's routine. Fellow cast and crew members described her as challenging to work with and largely focused on her own needs, more invested in her personal orbit than the ensemble around her. One producer reportedly summed up the overall mood on set as chaotic, comparing it to a circus, a description that stuck because it captured how much attention seemed to trail her wherever she went. This isn't meant as a final judgment of her character, only as the portrait painted by people who were actually there, and even those accounts vary on how much was real conflict versus simply a major celebrity operating the way major celebrities often do. Her casting had already reshaped the production once, having contributed to at least one earlier leading actress walking away before filming began. Whether the disruption she caused was worth the energy she brought to the role of May remains something the people who made the film still seem to disagree about, even decades later. Number 9. The acrobatic catch that captured the country. A photographer for Life magazine crouches at the edge of the field, angling for a shot that might sell this unfamiliar league to the nation. In the scene, Dottie clocks him lining up the photo and instantly transforms a routine catch into a piece of showmanship, dropping into a full split to snag a high pop-up and holding the pose just long enough to land herself on the cover of a national magazine. The moment dramatizes something the real All-American Girls Professional Baseball League actually practiced, staging attention-grabbing stunts and crowd-pleasing flourishes to keep fans coming through the gates during the lean war years. Surviving players who consulted on the production reportedly found Hollywood's playful exaggerations charming rather than off-putting. Spectacle and genuine history sit right next to each other in that single shot, and the film keeps finding real hardship tucked just under the polish. Number 10. Real blood under the makeup. Because the women did their own playing on screen, the wear and tear they took on was no illusion. All that training had paid off, but it also meant something less glamorous, that whenever a body went hard into the dirt, there was no stunt arrangement standing by to soften the actual blow. The marks they came away with ran deep. One actress reportedly carried a thigh bruise so severe that it lingered on her body for years afterward, the kind of injury that outlasts the entire production and then keeps going. Another took a flying mitt to the face hard enough to break her nose outright, and a third later said she had broken a foot somewhere during the long shoot. Geena Davis herself described how sliding in the short period skirts the real league had worn would scrape the skin clean off the player's legs, take after take. That one detail reframes every easy-looking slide in the movie. The grace the camera so admiringly catches was being paid for, over and over, in skin and bone. For a warm, feel-good comedy, the film asked a startlingly physical price of the people in it, one paid in full by performers who had already trained for months and then went out and absorbed every hard hit themselves, with nobody standing in to take it for them. Number 11. Hanks's endless bathroom break. The camera holds, locked and unmoving on one doorway, while Jimmy Dugan takes his time and the players are left standing around to wait on him. In one of the film's strangest comic stretches, a bleary, run-down Dugan wanders off to relieve himself directly in front of his own team and then stays there far past the point of any comfort, the shot stubbornly refusing to cut away. Hanks committed to the bit completely and without vanity, letting it run on long enough to become almost unbearable to sit through, which was precisely the read he was after. The sheer endlessness of it is the entire joke. Every extra second the scene refuses to move forward sells how little this broken man cares about the women in front of him or the job he is supposed to be doing. It became one of the most quoted comic beats in the movie because Hanks was willing to push it well past the point where a more cautious actor would have lost his nerve and called cut. He pulled durable humor straight out of the character at his lowest point. Number 12. The secret newsletter and mayo Oreos. For a while, an anonymous gossip sheet kept turning up around the production, dishing on who had been out too late and who had been getting friendly with whom. Nobody on the cast or crew seemed to know who was writing the thing. The mystery author, it turned out, was Tom Hanks, running a one-man tabloid on his own film purely for the fun of it. He was not the only one keeping the mood loose. Geena Davis took to scraping the cream out of Oreos, replacing it with mayonnaise, then offering the doctored cookies to unsuspecting crew members. It is an odd image, a future two-time Oscar winner patiently building booby-trapped snacks between takes and waiting to see who bit. The prank-heavy streak ran straight through a shoot that was, by every account, long and physically punishing. That contrast says something about the people who made the film. A cast putting their bodies through months of grueling work, kept each other going with fake newsletters and rigged cookies, a wholesome group with a mischievous streak running underneath it all. Number 13. The role written just for Jon Lovitz. On paper, the part was almost nothing. A sour, fast-talking talent scout who turns up early in the story and then vanishes from it. On screen, that same small part walks off with nearly every scene it touches. Ernie Capadino, the sarcastic recruiter who drags Dottie and Kit out of rural Oregon and into the league, was written specifically and deliberately for Jon Lovitz. The fit between actor and role was exact. Test audiences ended up settling the rest of it. They laughed hardest and loudest at Capodino's nastiest, most cutting lines, so the filmmakers made an interesting choice, trimming the role down in length while sharpening everything that remained, concentrating the meanness until every second of his limited screen time carried a punch. A small part somehow got both smaller and considerably funnier at the same time. Then there is the on-set legend that has trailed the role ever since. During one of his farm scenes, a cow reportedly gave birth there during filming, the calf afterward nicknamed Penny in honor of the director, while Lovitz himself supposedly never once noticed any of it happening behind him. Whether or not every detail of that story holds up, it fits the role perfectly anyway. A born scene stealer so locked into his own deadpan that a live birth could unfold a few feet away and go unremarked. Number 14. The candy mogul who built the league. In the early 1940s, with the United States now deep in the Second World War, the men who played professional baseball for a living were steadily trading their team uniforms for military ones. Up and down the major leagues, owners watched with mounting alarm as their rosters thinned out and their biggest stars enlisted and shipped overseas, and a fear began to take hold across the sport that baseball itself might simply have to go dark for the duration of the conflict. The film hangs its origin story on Walter Harvey, the candy tycoon played by Gary Marshall, a businessman who bankrolls a brand new women's league, largely to keep his ballparks lit and earning while the men are away at war. Harvey is a barely disguised stand-in for a real figure, Philip K. Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate and Chicago Cubs owner who in actual history helped launch the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League for strikingly similar reasons. The motive, in both the movie and the historical record, was at least partly protective and commercial. A baseball business staring down an empty wartime season had an obvious financial interest in finding someone, anyone, to keep filling the seats. So the women's game stepped in to answer that need, while the established men's product was on hold. The production then folded that real history neatly back into its own making. The filmmakers staged the league's tryout scenes at Wrigley Field itself, the storied ballpark named for the family the fictional Harvey had been modeled on, turning an ordinary shooting location into a quiet in-joke for anyone who happened to know the backstory. The warm comedy, in the end, rests on a genuine and slightly uncomfortable piece of business history, a women's league brought into being in no small part to safeguard a men's enterprise until its regular players could finally come marching home. Number 15. The backstory Hanks invented himself come into Tomai. For a long while, the character would not come into focus for him. Hanks could play the bitterness sitting right there on the surface, the slumped posture and the curled lip contempt, but he kept failing to find the deeper wound underneath it all, the thing that actually explained why Jimmy Dugan had given up so completely on himself. The script as written did not hand that answer to him, so he decided to build it on his own. The private history he invented turned out to be remarkably specific. In Hanks's own version of events, Dugan had wrecked his knee for good in a clumsy, undignified late-night scramble out of a situation he had no business being anywhere near, a foolish, self-inflicted injury that ended a promising playing career in an instant and left the man behind with nothing but regret. That self-made backstory unlocked everything else about the performance, the hard living, the bone-deep apathy, the sense of a man who had carelessly thrown away the one true gift he was ever given. Hanks went on to describe Dugan as someone making a series of small, grim daily compromises to get out of bed each morning. Almost none of that invented history ever reached the screen as a line of spoken dialogue, and yet it shaped the shadow of every scene he is in. The particular version of Dugan that audiences came to love so much was built largely inside the actor's own head, an entire interior life the finished script never once spelled out, but that Hanks carried into every frame regardless. Number 16. Ballparks rebuilt to look like 1943. Fresh paint over old wood. Period signage hung back up. Bunting strung in long loops along weathered grandstands that had been coaxed back several decades in time. Recreating the precise look of 1943 meant physically rebuilding the places themselves rather than faking any of it on a soundstage. Wrigley Field stood in for the fictional Harvey Field, lending the production its genuine, irreplaceable ivy and brick. The Peaches needed a believable home park of their own, so the production tracked down an aging stadium in Indiana and renovated it into Rockford's Ballpark, a venue that would later be renamed in the film's own honor. A second Indiana park was dressed to serve as the home of the rival Racine team, while a Chicago cultural center supplied the elegant rooms used for the charm school sequences. Every one of these locations had to be carefully dressed backward into a vanished era, down to the uniforms, the team buses, and the painted advertisements ringing the outfield walls. The end result was an effortless-looking Americana that had, in truth, taken enormous and invisible effort to assemble, every frame of small-town 1940s baseball reconstructed piece by careful piece. Holding all of it together at once, on parks scattered across 2 different states for a long, demanding stretch of filming, took the kind of sustained, day-to-day closeness that tends to forge something lasting among the people living through it together. Number 17. The cast staged their own musical, deep into the back half of the long shooting schedule, stuck on locations far from home with idle downtime piling up between camera setups. The company eventually found an unusual way to keep itself entertained. The actors went ahead and mounted a full amateur stage production among themselves, an elaborate, ambitious bit of homemade theater put on purely for their own amusement in the middle of the long grind of filming. It says a great deal about what those months were like. Here was a film about a single baseball season being stretched across a full season's worth of filming, shot on remote parks where the cast often had little to do but lean on each other's company, and that enforced closeness ended up producing exactly the kind of deep ensemble bond the story on screen was fundamentally about. The off-hours invention mirrored something true. The women of the historical league had always described their own seasons mainly in terms of the tight community they built together on the road, the lasting friendships that ended up outliving the games themselves by decades. The parallel there was certainly not lost on anyone who knew the history going in. Whether the cast consciously set out to recreate that famous camaraderie for themselves or stumbled headlong into it through sheer boredom and proximity is hard to say now, though the warm result looked, from the outside, a great deal like the thing it was imitating. Number 18. Charm School was no exaggeration. Watching the film today, the strangest touches feel like pure comic invention, the kind of broad-period absurdity a screenwriter might dream up to land a laugh. Grown women handed personal chaperones, players sent off to evening deportment classes, fines for unbecoming conduct, athletes made to slide and dive across the dirt in skirts. Almost every bit of it was real. These details were lifted more or less straight out of the league rulebook of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. The women really were sent off to evening classes in deportment, etiquette, and presentation, where they were taught how to walk, sit, and carry themselves in public, watched over constantly by assigned chaperones, and made subject to real penalties for any behavior the league happened to deem unladylike. The notoriously short skirts were a genuine enforced uniform requirement, kept in place despite the scrapes and burns they caused the players on the base paths. Surviving members of the real league who consulted on the movie went on record to confirm that the filmmakers had, if anything, undersold how strict and controlling the regime could be. All of it grew directly out of an institutional anxiety. The league was trying to sell something it feared the wartime American public might flatly reject, the sight of women playing a hard, fast, traditionally male game, so it deliberately wrapped its athletes in an exaggerated, carefully managed femininity to make the product feel palatable and safe. The most cartoonish-seeming elements in the entire film turned out, on inspection, to be its most scrupulously faithful, a comedy's broadest strokes drawn directly and almost without alteration from the historical record. Number 19. A silent nod to baseball's color line. A ball skips loose down the foul side and rolls toward a black woman standing at the edge of the crowd, outside the fence that marks where the players belong. She picks it up. For a moment, everyone waits to see what she will do, and then she fires it back across the field with a throw so hard and so accurate that it stops the players cold. The exchange lasts only seconds, carried by a soft swell in Hans Zimmer's score, and no dialogue at all. The moment acknowledges what the rest of the film mostly leaves alone. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was segregated, closed to black players in the same era that the sport as a whole drew its color line, and this brief shot is the movie's one deliberate gesture toward that exclusion. A woman with obvious, undeniable talent, kept on the wrong side of a fence for no reason that bears defending. The film does not stop to explain her or follow where her story might have gone. She throws the ball, the players register it, and the scene moves on. A whole history sits compressed into those few unspoken seconds. A door opened just wide enough to show what lies behind it before the movie quietly closes it again. The 2022 reboot would later give that story the room this version never found, though here it stays exactly where the shot leaves it, unanswered and deliberately so. Number 20. The real Dottie was a lefty legend. The flesh and blood ballplayer standing behind Dottie Hinson went by the name Dorothy Kamenchek. Known around the league as Cammy, she was one of the undisputed stars of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, a feared and disciplined hitter and a first baseman so naturally gifted that a major league scout once called her among the finest fielding first basemen he had ever laid eyes on, man or woman alike. The film borrowed her aura and stature while changing nearly all the particulars. Kamenchek batted and threw left-handed and anchored first base across a long and richly decorated career, whereas the fictional Dottie is written as a right-handed catcher who quits the game after a single season. The contrast between the two is the point. Where the movie's heroine chooses to walk away at the height of her powers for a quiet life at home, the woman who helped inspire her kept playing at an elite level for the better part of a decade, the genuine great standing behind the invented one. Number 21. A milestone no woman had reached. More than $100 million in domestic ticket sales, all of it earned by a modest summer comedy that a great many people had filed away under pleasant and minor. That figure made the film the first one ever directed by a woman to clear the $100 million mark in American theaters, a line that no female director in the history of the business had managed to cross before Penny Marshall went and did it. It also ranked for a good stretch of time as the highest-grossing baseball movie that had ever been made. The picture opened strong out of the gate and then did something considerably rarer, climbing rather than fading away, rising all the way up to the #1 spot in its second weekend, purely on the strength of word of mouth. A barrier fell almost without anyone bothering to frame it that way at the time, a so-called light entertainment rewriting a record while everyone in the audience was busy enjoying themselves. Number 22. The scenes that hit the cutting floor. Several finished or carefully planned moments never made it into the version of the film that audiences finally saw. One of them was a scene built around Walter Harvey's hidden office bar, a piece of lavish set decoration so elaborate that the production reportedly staged a beat to show it off on camera. Another deleted scene unpacked the cheeky origin of the All the Way May nickname attached to Madonna's character. A third was a longer conversation that dug directly into the state of Dottie's marriage. Marshall's guiding instinct in the editing room was always to protect the central emotional through-line above everything else. Anything that slowed down the core story of the two sisters, no matter how clever or beautifully shot it happened to be, immediately became a candidate to lose, and so these particular scenes lost out to the demands of pace. Cutting them, as it turned out, had a genuinely odd side effect. Stripped of their explanation, several of the characters actually grew more iconic rather than less, their unexplained gaps now inviting the audience to lean in and fill in whatever the film had chosen to withhold. The movie that finally reached theaters was shaped at least as much by careful subtraction as by anything ever written into it in the first place. How different it might feel today with all of those scenes quietly restored, whether richer for it or simply slower, is exactly the sort of unanswerable question that keeps a film's deleted footage interesting for decades after the fact. Number 23. The song that vanished from the album. There was a hit single tied directly to the movie that, oddly enough, you could not find anywhere on the movie's own soundtrack record. Madonna had recorded a song that plays over the closing credits, scoring the film's emotional farewell, and yet when the official soundtrack album finally shipped to stores, that very track was missing from it. The reason behind the gap was contractual rather than creative. Rights issues and label politics, exactly the kind of dry behind-the-scenes machinery that almost never touches the actual audience, conspired to keep the song off the one album it most obviously belonged on. The track had other commitments tying it up elsewhere, and the various companies involved either could not or would not line up all the necessary permissions to let it sit alongside the rest of the film's music. So it went its own separate way instead, going on to become a substantial hit on its own terms, charting well and reaching huge numbers of listeners who may never once have connected it back to the baseball picture it came from. That split left behind a strange gap. A successful, instantly recognizable piece of music that closes out the entire film was somehow absent from the one product specifically built to collect that film's songs in one place. How many ordinary fans even noticed the omission at the time, or stopped to wonder where exactly the closing song had wandered off to when they finally brought the album home, is honestly anyone's guess. Number 24. The finale filled with real players, Gray-haired women now in their 70s move slowly through the quiet halls of the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, taking their places for an induction ceremony that honors the league they had played some half a century earlier. For the film's emotional closing stretch, the production made a remarkable choice and filled that entire reunion not with hired extras, but with dozens of genuine, surviving veterans of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, the women whose long-buried careers the movie had been circling back toward the entire time. That choice gave the ending a weight and an authenticity that no amount of careful casting could ever have manufactured from scratch. These were the people the story had belonged to all along, gathered together to watch their own erased history finally set down in the official record where it should rightfully have been. The fictional characters and the real-life athletes ended up sharing the same frame, the invented Peaches standing shoulder to shoulder among the women who had once lived every bit of it. The entire emotional charge of those final few minutes runs directly off that quiet overlap, the unmistakable sense that the film is gently handing the moment back to the people it had always been about. There is one more grace note buried in there. One former pitcher from the old league delivers the line that carries the most weight in the sequence, looking directly toward Gina Davis's character and calling her, with no fanfare at all, simply the best player in the league. Number 25. From a hit to the film registry, the Library of Congress eventually decided the movie belonged among the works it preserves for the nation. The carefully guarded federal roster reserved for cinema, judged culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Being named to the National Film Registry placed a humble summer comedy, one once waved off by more than a few critics as mere light entertainment, onto the same protected list as the acknowledged classics of American cinema. By then, the film had long since become an evergreen, the kind of beloved title that turns up endlessly on cable and streaming and keeps pulling in fresh viewers every year, all while doing cultural work as one of the films that helped make women's sports stories feel like legitimate, bankable subjects in the first place. The recognition itself arrived years after the first reviews had sized the thing up and promptly moved on. Time did the thing that time occasionally does, slowly turning what was once dismissed as a charming little movie into something a whole country eventually decided was worth keeping. Number 26. The spin-off that struck out fast. On paper, at least, a television version of the film had everything going for it, and yet it still managed to collapse almost the moment it arrived. CBS launched a weekly series based directly on the movie in 1993, with Penny Marshall herself directing the pilot episode and several of the film's own actors returning to reprise their original roles. Precisely the kind of pedigree that usually buys a new show at least a fair and patient hearing. The viewers, as it happened, did not bite. The series drew weak ratings right from the start and was gone again after only a small handful of episodes had aired, never once managing to recapture whatever elusive magic had made the original film work so well. Not even Tom Hanks himself, stepping behind the camera to direct an installment of it, could do anything to move those stubborn numbers. The movie went right on living for decades afterward, while its short-lived television cousin vanished almost overnight, a quiet reminder that the magic of the original would not transfer over just because so many of the same familiar names had been attached to it. Number 27. The darker ending they wisely cut. The final scene that most people have come to cherish so deeply almost gave way instead to a colder, considerably crueler version of itself, one that the filmmakers, to the film's lasting benefit, ultimately lost their nerve and decided against. An early draft of the screenplay pushed the last reunion between the two sisters somewhere far darker and more unsettling than the simple, wordless embrace that audiences eventually came to know and love. In that abandoned version of events, Kit confronts Dottie directly and outright, asking her point-blank whether she had deliberately let her win the deciding game of the championship. The blunt question drags out into the open the suspicion that still hangs quietly over the finished ending, the lingering possibility that Dottie, the stronger player of the two, dropped the ball at the plate entirely on purpose in order to hand her hungrier younger sister the biggest moment of her life. Spoken aloud like that, the raw accusation would have instantly turned a tender, ambiguous goodbye into something much closer to an interrogation, robbing the two sisters of the one fragile thing the finished film so generously grants them, a quiet refuge from the very rivalry that had defined their relationship. Marshall and her writers ultimately judged it far too psychologically dark and pulled it from the script. What remains in its place is a simple embrace with no words at all ever put to the question, the two sisters just holding on to each other, while every individual viewer fills the loaded silence with whatever private family drama they happen to carry into the theater. Whether or not Dottie truly threw that final game is left for the audience itself to decide, and the film is, without question, far more beloved today, precisely for its refusal to ever tell them. A film that should not have survived its own making came through all of it. The studio that let it go, the leads who trained and then walked, the most famous line nearly tossed aside, the scenes too dark to keep, and somehow what emerged was both a comedy people still quote by heart, and the reason millions of us know the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League ever existed. The warmth was hard-won, built on bruises, on the players who lived the history, on hard calls made in the editing room. I keep coming back to how much of what we love about this one was decided by what got left out. Of everything hiding behind the movie, I want to know which secret caught you most off guard, so tell me in the comments, and if it sent you to a corner of history you had not met before, like the video and subscribe so the next dig finds you too.